Section 3 of the Jen Kingwell Gypsy Wife Quilt Along. This is a quilt done in 10 sections. April is sections 3 and 4 with our Gypsy Wife Quilt Along. This video shows only section 3. Section 3 includes square in a square in a square, but I'm going to show both square and square and square and a square and a square, and I will explain that later. Square and square with border, square and square with courthouse steps, and color wheel. So the first for section 3 is a square and square, large square with 4 squares sewn on the corners to make a larger square and square. Okay, so this is my actual finished section 3, and I realized after the fact that what I had made was actually a square and a square instead of a square and a square and a square. So there's a little bit of discrepancy in the diagram on page 20. I'm sorry, I don't know the page. The diagram on page 27, it shows this. It shows the square and a square. And then on the front photograph of the quilt and in the table of contents with our quilt along, it shows square in a square in a square. So I'm going to show the square in a square, square in a square in a square as well. So I just did the square in a square. That's what's in my quilt. I'm not taking it out. I'm going to leave it. So here is the center block, the center square, and then use these smaller squares to make the square in a square, which is what I did. And then I realized that when I was doing the video editing, I realized that I should have done a square in a square in a square. So there is in fact an errata for this. Page 24, square in a square block was omitted. So I'm using the first edition of the book, and there's an errata where there is a square and a square and a square for the second edition. So that caught me up. That's why I'm kind of doing both the square and a square and the square in a square and a square block for section 3. Like I said, I left mine in my quilt. And then the bordered square and square, the first process is to make the center square and square block and then add the borders to that. Okay, the next square and square is a square and square with courthouse blocks, and it ends up being a fairly large square, and it goes right above the color wheel. So what you have is a square in the center which is on point, and then that is bordered on all 4 sides with strips, and then after you assemble that, then there are triangles that go onto each side, and the result is this square here. Now don't get too confused, because this does continue on to the next page, and it's the very top of the page. And what you see is additional strips that go around that to finish the correct size of the square in a square with courthouse blocks. So the first thing you want to do when you assemble this is to take the square, and you can even look at it this way, and just add the top and bottom strips and then add the side strips to make one finished square. So what you'll end up with is the square with courthouse steps in a square with an additional border of courthouse steps. So it's a little confusing. The instructions do go from one page to the next, so just be aware of that. Okay, so here I have color wheel. If you got this pattern before joining the group or looking at the different sections and deciding to do it by section, color wheel is the first pattern in the booklet, and it might have been the first block that you tried to make. So in color wheel, there's 4 different colors that go around the block. So here I have the fabrics cut out for my block. I have the larger square cut in half, the smaller square cut in half for the main fabrics. So I have 4 different fabrics for the main fabrics. The background fabric, squares, large and small, and then cut in half diagonally, and then the center fabric square. So I'm going to try to assemble this. So I do want to point out that the color wheel in the first edition of the book, of the pattern book, does have an incorrect diagram. So if you've seen that incorrect diagram, there is an errata page. There is a corrections page. So it's important to check the diagram, because if you try to assemble it using the diagram in the first edition book, it's not going to come out correctly. So here I am placing the dark, and I'm going to go around from dark to less dark to medium to light. So this is my next color. Put one there, and then one goes on the corner. These are a little hard to grab. And then the little one goes there like that. And then just fill in those empty spaces with the background fabric. Okay, my next color goes here and here. And like that, and I think I might have this one wrong. Needs a larger one. And then the last fabric fits in like that, and then out like that. And then the smaller one goes here, and then again fill in all the spaces with that background fabric. And then there's 2 of the larger triangles on the edges. So that's how color wheel is assembled. So I've got one main fabric in each of the 4 sides, the center square, and then the background triangles go around the edges. The first step of assembly is to assemble the corner units, so the larger triangles, the main color triangle and the background triangle get stitched together. And then press to the dark side. I am going to trim off the dog ears on each of these and then place it back where it belongs in my layout. So I like to keep all of my blocks in the layout as I sew, as I put them together. I think it helps with deciding my color placement to lay them out in the first place and make sure that they're in the correct locations. And I also like using the layout as I sew to make sure that I'm assembling them correctly. So the next step is to take the center piece and then sew the 2 smaller triangles. Can't see that very well. Take the centerpiece, the center sides, and sew the 2 small triangles together along this seam. Press open, and then come back and attach this triangle to complete that square. And then the final assembly step for color wheel is to sew those blocks together in rows and then attach the 3 rows together.